The crisp morning air bit at Captain Andre Wilson's face as he stood outside the employee entrance of Skyline Airways. His breath formed small clouds in the cold, and he pulled his jacket tighter around his uniform. The gold stripes on his sleeves caught the early sunlight. 20 years of flying experience, over 15,000 flight hours, and a perfect safety record, yet here he was, waiting outside while other pilots and flight attendants walked right past him into the building. "Sorry sir, I need to verify your credentials again," the security guard had told him 15 minutes earlier. "Just wait outside for a moment." Andre had noticed the guard didn't ask anyone else to wait. Not a single other employee, all of whom happened to be white, faced the same verification. Andre checked his watch. His pre-flight briefing started in 20 minutes, and passengers would begin boarding his Chicago-bound flight in just over an hour. He had never been late for a briefing in his entire career. The airline's policy was clear: pilots who missed briefings were removed from flights. No exceptions. He pulled out his phone and called the Flight Operations Center. "This is Captain Wilson. I'm scheduled for Flight SL-429 to Chicago, but security isn't letting me in the building." He kept his voice steady despite the frustration building inside him. "I'm showing you're cleared, Captain," came the confused reply. "Let me call down to security." 5 more minutes passed. Other crew members continued streaming into the building. Some nodded at Andre, a few looked confused to see a captain waiting outside, but no one stopped. His first officer, Tyler, spotted him and approached with a concerned expression. "Captain, what's going on? We have briefing in 10 minutes. Security says they need to verify my credentials, but they're taking their time about it," Andre explained, keeping his tone professional. Tyler frowned. "That's strange. I just walked right in. Want me to say something?" Andre shook his head. "No, they're supposedly working on it. Go ahead and start reviewing the flight plan. I'll be there shortly." After Tyler disappeared inside, Andre tried one more time with the security guard, who was now openly chatting and laughing with other employees as they entered. "Excuse me," Andre said, approaching the desk again. "I'm the captain for Flight SL-429 departing in an hour. My briefing starts very soon. Has my verification cleared?" The guard barely looked up from his computer. "Still processing, sir. Just wait outside a bit longer." Something in his dismissive tone made Andre pause. This wasn't just slow bureaucracy. 23 years of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination had taught him to recognize the signs. The guard was deliberately keeping him waiting. Andre made a decision. He pulled out his phone again, but this time he didn't call flight operations. Instead, he called the airline's chief operations officer, a contact he'd been given years ago after serving on a safety advisory committee. "Jeff, it's Andre Wilson. I have a situation at the Atlanta terminal that needs your immediate attention." The conversation was brief but effective. Within 3 minutes, the security desk phone rang. The guard's expression changed dramatically as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When he hung up, he immediately waved Andre through without meeting his eyes. Andre made it to the briefing room with just 2 minutes to spare. Tyler looked relieved. "Everything sorted?" he asked. "For now," Andre replied, opening his flight plan documents. "Let's focus on getting our passengers to Chicago safely." The briefing went smoothly, and Andre pushed the incident to the back of his mind as they discussed weather patterns and fuel calculations. But as they wrapped up, his phone buzzed with a text from Jeff. "This isn't the first report we've had. Can you meet after your return flight?" Andre's mind raced as they walked toward the gate. This wasn't just about him. If other black pilots were experiencing the same treatment, this was a systemic problem. He thought about the young black flight attendant he'd mentored last year who suddenly quit without explanation. He thought about the maintenance engineer who'd transferred to another hub after only 3 months. As they approached the gate, Andre could see their passengers already lining up to board. Families heading home, business people reviewing documents, students with headphones, all trusting him to get them safely to Chicago. He'd never let discrimination affect his performance in the cockpit, and today would be no different. But walking through the terminal, seeing the few but proud black faces among the airline staff, Andre knew this moment was bigger than one delayed entry or one humiliated captain. This was about everyone who came after him, about making sure the path was clearer for them than it had been for him. Tyler seemed to sense his thoughts. Whatever happened back there, that wasn't right. Andre nodded. No, it wasn't. And I don't think it's just happening to me. What are you going to do? Tyler asked as they approached the aircraft for their pre-flight inspection. Andre looked at the massive plane that represented both his life's passion and decades of hard work. First, we fly these people safely to Chicago, he said firmly. Then, when we get back, I'm going to make sure what happened today never happens to another pilot at this airline again. His mind was already formulating a plan, one that would require courage, documentation, and the solidarity of colleagues both black and white. By the time they returned to Atlanta, he would be ready to take action that would send shockwaves through Skyline Airways' entire operation. As Andre settled into the captain's seat and began his pre-flight checks, his determination solidified into certainty. The airline had no idea what was coming. The flight to Chicago went smoothly. Andre kept his focus entirely on his job, compartmentalizing the morning's incident as he'd learned to do with countless microaggressions throughout his career. The passengers never knew their captain had started his day being humiliated outside his own workplace. After landing at O'Hare, Andre sat in the quiet cockpit finishing his post-flight paperwork while Tyler helped oversee the deplaning. His phone buzzed with a message from Jeff, the COO, Conference Room B, 5 p.m. after you return. Bringing HR and legal. Andre frowned. He hadn't expected such a formal response. Was the company preparing to defend itself rather than address the problem? He'd seen it before, corporations wrapping discrimination complaints in layers of bureaucracy until they suffocated. Everything okay, Captain? Tyler asked, returning to the cockpit. Andre hesitated before deciding to trust his first officer. Not really. I've got a meeting with executives when we get back. About what happened this morning. Tyler sat in his chair, turning to face Andre directly. Listen, I've been flying with you for 3 years. You're the best captain I've worked with. What happened today wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. Appreciate that, Andre said, genuinely touched. I'm serious, Tyler continued. My brother-in-law's a civil rights attorney. This is textbook discrimination. And he hesitated. I've noticed things before. Comments in the break room. Different treatment. Andre nodded slowly. It's not just me, is it? No sir, Tyler replied. There's a pilot group text. Some of the guys say things when they think no one who'd care is listening. During their 3-hour layover, Andre made calls. First to Michael Thompson, another black captain based in Atlanta who'd been with Skyline even longer than Andre. Then to Diane Chen, a first officer who'd confided in Andre about facing both racial and gender discrimination at the airline. That security guard has done the same to me twice, Michael confirmed. I reported it to my union rep last month. Nothing happened. Diane's experience was similar. It's not just security. Scheduling gives me all the less desirable routes. When I complained, my supervisor said I should be grateful to have the job. By the time Andre boarded the return flight to Atlanta, he had spoken with 5 minority pilots and flight attendants. Each had stories that followed the same pattern: systematic exclusion, subtle humiliations, promotional opportunities mysteriously evaporating. During the flight back, Andre formulated his approach for the meeting. He knew corporate tactics: minimize, individualize, and compartmentalize. They'd try to frame what happened as a single incident with a single security guard rather than acknowledging the pattern. When they landed in Atlanta, Tyler caught Andre before he left the cockpit. "Whatever happens in that meeting, I've got your back," he said, offering his hand. "If you need a witness, I'm there." Andre shook it firmly. "Thanks. That means more than you know." The walk to conference room B felt longer than usual. Andre passed dozens of Skyline employees, wondering how many had faced similar treatment. Near the crew lounge, he spotted Maria, a black flight attendant he'd flown with previously. "Captain Wilson," she called out. "Got a minute?" She lowered her voice when he approached. "I heard you're meeting with the brass about what's happening here. Just wanted you to know, we're all watching. Whatever you need." Word had spread faster than he'd anticipated. There was clearly an underground network of minority employees communicating below the company's radar. Andre arrived at the conference room precisely at 5 p.m., uniform still crisp despite the long day. Inside sat Jeff, the COO, along with Patricia from Human Resources and a woman Andre didn't recognize who was presumably from legal. "Captain Wilson, thank you for coming," Jeff began formally. "This is Patricia Young from HR and Veronica Williams, our general counsel." Andre took careful note that they'd brought their most senior black attorney. "A predictable strategy. We've reviewed the security footage from this morning," Jeff continued. "The behavior was completely unacceptable. The guard has been suspended pending investigation." "I appreciate that," Andre replied carefully. "But I think we all know this isn't about one security guard." Patricia leaned forward. "We take these matters very seriously, Captain. If you've experienced other incidents—" "It's not just me," Andre interrupted, placing his phone on the table. "In the past few hours, I've spoken with 13 Skyline employees, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, mechanics. Each one has experienced similar discrimination. Different locations, different supervisors, same pattern." The room fell silent. Veronica made a note on her legal pad. "That's concerning," Jeff said finally. "We'd need to investigate each claim individually, of course." Andre had anticipated this exact response. "With respect, sir, individual investigations allow individual denials. This is a systemic problem requiring a systemic solution." He pulled out a folder containing printouts of emails he'd collected over the years, schedule changes that disproportionately affected minority pilots, maintenance requests that were mysteriously delayed when he submitted them, performance reviews with subtly different language than those of his white counterparts. "I've documented everything," Andre said quietly. "So have others. We've been waiting for the right moment to bring this forward cohesively." "Are you threatening legal action?" Veronica asked, her tone professional but wary. "I'm offering an opportunity," Andre corrected. "To fix this before it becomes a class action lawsuit or a media story that none of us wants. I love flying for Skyline. I've given 20 years to this airline. I want it to be better, not damaged." The tension in the room was palpable. Patricia glanced at Jeff, who was studying Andre with new respect. "What exactly are you proposing?" Jeff asked finally. Andre took a deep breath. "A comprehensive review of policies and practices affecting minority employees. An independent auditor. Transparent reporting of hiring and promotion statistics. And immediate suspension of any employee with verified discrimination complaints, not just one security guard." "That's extensive," Patricia said. "So is the problem," Andre replied firmly. Jeff leaned back in his chair. "I'll need to discuss this with the CEO and the board." "Of course," Andre said, standing up. "You have until my next scheduled flight, Thursday morning. After that, I and 27 other pilots and flight attendants will be calling in sick. Simultaneously." The implications were clear. 28 crew members calling out sick would ground dozens of flights, costing the airline millions in a single day. That would be highly irresponsible, Veronica warned. More irresponsible than allowing systematic discrimination to continue? Andre asked quietly. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equal treatment. As he left the conference room, Andre felt a weight both lifted and added. The next 48 hours would determine whether his 20-year career at Skyline had a future. But more importantly, they would determine whether the airline itself had a future worth being part of. His phone was already buzzing with messages from the other pilots and crew members waiting to hear how the meeting went. The movement was building momentum faster than even Andre had anticipated. Whatever happened next, Skyline Airways would never be the same. Word spread through Skyline Airways like wildfire. By Tuesday morning, Andre's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from employees he'd never even met. I'm with you, Captain. Been dealing with this for 8 years. Whatever you need. The underground network had existed all along, people sharing their experiences in whispers, warning each other about which managers to avoid, which routes had the most hostile crews. But they'd never organized, never pushed back collectively. Until now. Andre sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by printed emails and text messages. His wife Tanya placed a cup of coffee beside him. You sure about this? She asked softly. 20 years at Skyline. That's a lot to risk. Andre looked up at her. If I don't do this, what message does that send to our kids? That it's okay to be treated as less than? That you should just accept discrimination as the cost of having a career? Tanya nodded, squeezing his shoulder. She understood. By Tuesday afternoon, Andre's original count of 27 crew members willing to call in sick had grown to 43. The potential impact had escalated from dozens of cancelled flights to a partial shutdown of Skyline's operations in 3 major hubs. His phone rang. Jeff, the COO. Captain Wilson. The board has agreed to meet tomorrow morning. They want you there. Andre hadn't expected this. Pilots didn't meet with board members. This was either very good or very bad. Who else will be there? Andre asked cautiously. CEO, full executive team, 2 board members, Jeff replied. And, they've asked if you would bring 2 representatives of your group. We'll be there, Andre said, keeping his voice neutral despite the surge of hope he felt. He immediately called Michael and Diane. The 3 of them spent hours preparing, anticipating every possible corporate response, from total capitulation to hostile rejection. Wednesday morning arrived with a tense energy. The boardroom at Skyline headquarters was intimidating by design, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the airport runways, a massive table of polished mahogany, leather chairs that cost more than a month's salary. Andre, Michael, and Diane entered as a unified front. 8 people already sat waiting, CEO Richard Harrington, Jeff, various executives Andre recognized, and 2 stern-faced board members. Thank you for coming, Richard began. I understand there are concerns about equal treatment of minority employees at Skyline. The understatement was so profound that Michael actually laughed, then caught himself. Mr. Harrington, Andre said calmly, what's happening at Skyline goes beyond concerns. We have documented evidence of systematic discrimination affecting dozens of employees across multiple departments. So we've heard, one board member said. We've spent the last 24 hours reviewing the material Mr. Jeffries shared with us. It's troubling. Andre glanced at Jeff, surprised. The COO had apparently been more forthcoming with the board than expected. We've prepared a response, Richard said, sliding folders across to each of them. Andre opened his with steady hands, prepared for corporate doublespeak and deflection. Instead, he found a detailed action plan, independent auditors, review of all practices, immediate suspension of 3 management-level employees pending investigation, and a commitment to transparent reporting. "This is comprehensive," Diane said, clearly surprised. "It's a start," Richard replied. "The truth is, we can't afford, financially or ethically, to ignore this issue any longer. But we need something from you as well." "What's that?" Andre asked cautiously. "Time," the CEO said. "And your direct involvement in implementing these changes. We need people who've experienced these problems to help fix them." Andre exchanged looks with Michael and Diane. This wasn't at all what they'd expected. The meeting ended with cautious handshakes and a follow-up scheduled for Friday. As they left the building, Michael turned to Andre. "Think they're serious?" "I think they're scared," Andre replied. "And that might be enough to create real change." Thursday morning brought a strange mix of tension and hope to Skyline Airways. Andre arrived at the terminal for his scheduled flight to Denver with the agreement freshly signed but uncertainty still hanging in the air. Would the company follow through, or was this elaborate theater to prevent a mass sick-out? The answer began revealing itself immediately. The security guard who had stopped Andre was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a woman Andre didn't recognize checked his credentials with professional courtesy. "Good morning, Captain Wilson," she said. "Have a safe flight." In the crew lounge, conversations hushed when Andre entered. Some pilots nodded in solidarity, others looked away uncomfortably. The division was clear, those who supported the changes and those who feared them. His phone pinged with a message from Diane, "Just got word. External auditors arriving Monday. This is really happening." The flight to Denver was routine, but the atmosphere throughout the airline was anything but. By the time Andre landed and checked his messages, the CEO had sent a company-wide email announcing a comprehensive review of equality practices, without mentioning what had triggered it. "Typical corporate move," Michael commented when they spoke by phone. "Taking credit for addressing a problem without admitting it existed." "At least they're doing something," Andre replied. "Let's see if it sticks." Friday's follow-up meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. Andre, Michael, and Diane arrived together to find a different setup, a conference room instead of the intimidating boardroom, and a smaller group, the CEO, Jeff, the head of HR, and a woman introduced as Dr. Alicia Johnson, the independent auditor. "We've already begun the process," Richard explained. "Dr. Johnson's team will conduct interviews with staff at all levels over the next 3 weeks." Dr. Johnson spoke directly to Andre and his colleagues. "Our firm specializes in workplace equity issues. We're not here to whitewash or rubber stamp. We'll find the problems, regardless of who they implicate." Andre studied her, looking for signs of corporate capture. He saw none. "What happens after your report?" Diane asked. "That's where you come in," Richard answered. "We're forming an equality advisory committee with decision-making authority. We'd like all 3 of you to serve on it." Michael laughed dryly. "So we go from troublemakers to committee members in 1 week? Sometimes the people who cause the most trouble are exactly who you need," Jeff said with unexpected candor. As the meeting concluded, Andre felt cautiously optimistic. But back in the terminal, reality set in when he overheard 2 white pilots talking around a corner. "This witch hunt is going to ruin the company," one said. "Wilson and his crowd won't be satisfied until white pilots are second-class citizens." "It'll blow over," the other replied. "These things always do. Management will make some noise, change a few policies nobody follows anyway, and everything goes back to normal." Andre stepped around the corner, making his presence known. The pilots fell silent, nodding awkwardly before hurrying away. That evening, Andre met with an expanded group of minority employees at a hotel near the airport, now nearly 60 people, including maintenance workers, gate agents, and flight attendants. "Management is saying the right things," Andre explained. But we need to keep the pressure on. A young black flight attendant raised her hand. I filed 3 harassment complaints last year. HR lost all of them. How do we know this isn't just another way to identify the troublemakers? It was a valid concern. Many nodded in agreement. That's why we stay organized, Andre replied. We document everything. We protect each other. And if they're not serious about change. He paused, making eye contact around the room. We still have the power to shut down this airline. The room filled with murmurs of agreement. The movement was growing stronger, but the real work, and the real resistance, was just beginning. The next 2 weeks brought a whirlwind of activity at Skyline Airways. Dr. Johnson's team conducted hundreds of interviews, reviewed thousands of documents, and analyzed promotion and disciplinary records going back 5 years. Meanwhile, Andre and his colleagues continued their regular flight schedules, watching closely for any signs of backsliding on management's promises. On Tuesday morning, Andre spotted a familiar face in the crew lounge, Keith Hudson, Skyline's vice president of operations, deep in conversation with a group of senior pilots. As Andre passed, he caught fragments of their discussion. Overblown situation, unnecessary disruption. Wilson doesn't speak for everyone. Andre paused at the coffee machine, pretending not to notice while listening intently. Keith had been conspicuously absent from all the meetings so far, despite overseeing many of the departments with reported issues. Captain Wilson, Keith called out suddenly, having noticed Andre's presence. Join us for a moment. Andre approached the group, noting the uncomfortable expressions on several pilots' faces. We were just discussing the changes happening around here, Keith said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Some concerns about how they might affect operational efficiency. I'd say eliminating discrimination improves efficiency, Andre replied evenly. Talent thrives when people are treated fairly. One of the older pilots, Captain Reynolds, cleared his throat. No one's denying that, Wilson. But this external audit, these committees, it's creating an atmosphere where people are walking on eggshells. Afraid to make normal operational decisions for fear they'll be labeled discriminatory. Andre had anticipated this argument, the suggestion that addressing discrimination somehow hampered the airline's function, as if fairness and efficiency were mutually exclusive. Interesting perspective, Andre said carefully. Would you mind sharing some specific examples of operational decisions that have been compromised? Reynolds looked to Keith, who smoothly interjected, it's more about the atmosphere, Andre. People feeling monitored, judged. Sounds familiar, Andre said, letting the implication hang in the air. Later that day, Andre received a text from Maria, the flight attendant. Hudson's gathering statements from employees saying they've never experienced discrimination. Pressuring people to sign. Andre immediately contacted Dr. Johnson, who assured him such attempts to undermine the audit would themselves be documented. But the incident confirmed what Andre had suspected, there was an organized resistance to change within Skyline's management. By the third week, battle lines were clearly drawn. The Equality Advisory Committee had begun meeting regularly, with Andre, Michael, and Diane joined by 4 other employees representing different departments and backgrounds. Across from them sat members of management, some genuinely engaged, others clearly there to monitor and contain the damage. During one particularly tense meeting, Keith finally showed his hand. While I appreciate everyone's commitment, he began in a tone that suggested the opposite, we need to be realistic about the financial implications. Implementing all these recommendations could cost millions in training, new hiring processes, and reorganization. The board has shareholders to answer to. Andre had been waiting for this moment, the inevitable pivot to financial concerns as a reason to limit change. Actually, Andre replied, sliding a document across the table, our team prepared a cost analysis. Discrimination is already costing Skyline millions each year in turnover, lost talent, and decreased productivity. Not to mention the potential cost of class action lawsuits, which our lawyers estimate at upwards of $50 million. Keith's face reddened as he scanned the meticulously prepared report. "Where did you get this data?" he demanded. "The same place you did," Michael answered. "Company records. We just looked at them through a different lens." The meeting ended abruptly, with Keith claiming he needed to review the numbers with finance. But the damage was done. Other management team members had seen the data and looked visibly concerned. Back in the hallway, Diane squeezed Andre's arm. "That was brilliant. Did you see their faces?" Andre nodded, but his expression remained serious. "They're regrouping, not retreating. Keith has too much to lose if this audit reveals what we think it will." "So what's next?" Michael asked. Andre checked his watch. "We fly our routes. We gather more data. And we prepare for whatever they throw at us next." The preliminary audit findings landed like a bombshell. Dr. Johnson's team called a special meeting with only the Equality Advisory Committee present, no management. "I wanted you to see this before we present to executives tomorrow," Dr. Johnson explained, distributing sealed folders. "Prepare yourselves. It's worse than we thought." Andre opened his folder and found himself staring at irrefutable evidence. Charts showed minority employees were 37% less likely to be promoted than white counterparts with identical qualifications. Disciplinary actions were issued at nearly 3 times the rate. Pay disparities averaged 14% for the same positions and experience levels. Most damning were the emails. Keith Hudson and several other executives had openly discussed ways to limit minority advancement without triggering legal issues. "Keep the flight deck looking traditional," was Hudson's exact phrase in one email to a hiring manager. "This is..." Diane couldn't find the words. "Illegal," Dr. Johnson finished for her. "Textbook discrimination with clear paper trails. How did they think they'd get away with this?" Michael asked, still reading through the evidence. "They always have before," Andre replied quietly. "At Skyline and everywhere else." The group spent hours preparing for the next day's presentation, anticipating denials, deflections, and attempts to discredit the findings. By the time they finished, it was nearly midnight. Outside the building, Andre found Tyler waiting in the parking lot. "Thought you might need a friendly face," the first officer said. "Word spreading about tomorrow's meeting. Pilots are taking sides." "How bad is it?" Andre asked. Tyler hesitated. "There's talk of a counter-petition. Some captains are claiming the whole process is undermining safety by creating division. They've got about 40 signatures." "Out of how many pilots?" "About 400, Tyler replied. "But they're mostly senior captains with influence." Andre nodded, processing this. "And the rest?" "Waiting to see what happens tomorrow," Tyler said. "Most know things aren't right, but they're scared. People have families, mortgages." The next morning, the main conference room was packed. Every executive, the full board of directors, legal counsel, and HR representatives sat facing Dr. Johnson's team and the Equality Advisory Committee. The tension was palpable. Dr. Johnson's presentation was clinical and devastating. She methodically laid out patterns of discrimination so clear that they couldn't be attributed to coincidence or misinterpretation. When she displayed the incriminating emails, several board members visibly winced. Keith Hudson's face cycled through expressions, dismissive, then angry, then alarmed as he realized how thoroughly his communications had been exposed. When Dr. Johnson finished, CEO Richard Harrington looked shaken. "These findings are..." He began, then stopped, searching for words. "They demand immediate action." Keith interjected, with respect, "Many of these emails are taken out of context. And the statistical disparities can be explained by..." "They can't," Dr. Johnson cut him off. "We controlled for every variable, experience, education, performance metrics. The pattern is unmistakable and indefensible. The board chair, an older white man who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. I think we need to discuss this privately before determining next steps. Andre exchanged glances with his colleagues. This was the moment they'd feared, management closing ranks, taking the discussion behind closed doors where it could be contained and minimized. But before the chair could adjourn the meeting, the boardroom door opened. A young woman from legal entered, whispering urgently to the general counsel. After a brief exchange, the counsel stood up. Mr. Chairman, I need to advise the board immediately. The audit findings have leaked. They're trending on social media, and we've received inquiries from 3 major news outlets. The room erupted in chaos. Through the noise, Andre caught Keith Hudson's eyes fixed on him, burning with accusation. But Andre was just as surprised as everyone else. He hadn't leaked anything, he'd been counting on the internal process working. Now everything had changed, and Skyline Airways was about to face public scrutiny unlike anything in its history. By nightfall, Skyline Airways was in full crisis mode. #Skyline discrimination trended nationwide. News vans camped outside headquarters. The company's stock plummeted 17% in a single day. Overnight, Andre went from being an internal whistleblower to the public face of the controversy. His phone rang constantly with interview requests from major networks. His inbox filled with messages from minority aviation professionals across the country sharing similar experiences. We need to talk, Tanya said, setting down her tablet displaying yet another news story featuring Andre's name. This is bigger than Skyline now. Andre nodded, exhausted but resolute. I know. I never wanted this spotlight, but here we are. The next morning, an emergency all-hands meeting was called. The boardroom could no longer contain the crowd, so they moved to the company's largest training facility. Hundreds of employees packed in, with visible divisions as people clustered with like-minded colleagues. The board chair took the podium first. In light of recent events, we're announcing immediate changes. Keith Hudson has been placed on administrative leave pending review. We've engaged an independent law firm to conduct a full investigation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Hudson, seated in the front row, stared straight ahead, rigid with anger. The chair continued, additionally, we're implementing all recommendations from Dr. Johnson's preliminary report effective immediately. Captain Andre Wilson will head a permanent diversity and inclusion council with direct reporting access to the board. Andre, sitting between Michael and Diane, felt a conflicting mix of vindication and wariness. Was this real change or crisis management? As if reading his thoughts, the chair added, we recognize that announcements in moments of crisis can seem like empty gestures. That's why we're taking the unprecedented step of shutting down all non-essential operations for 3 days next week for mandatory company-wide training. The room erupted in shocked whispers. An airline voluntarily grounding hundreds of flights would cost millions. This will impact our finances, our schedules, and our reputation, the chair acknowledged. But continuing with a culture of discrimination would cost us far more, in talent, in legal liability, and in our integrity as a company. After the meeting, pilots and crew members approached Andre, some to offer support, others to express concern about the operational shutdown. Was this what you wanted all along? One captain asked accusingly. To shut down the airline? Andre met his gaze steadily. What I wanted was to be treated with the same respect as you. The shutdown isn't the goal, it's what happens when problems are ignored until they can't be anymore. As Andre walked through the facility, he noticed something significant changing. People were talking, really talking, about issues long swept under the rug. The 3-day shutdown transformed Skyline Airways in ways no one had anticipated. What started as mandatory training evolved into something more profound, a company-wide reckoning. On day 1, employees arrived expecting corporate videos and paperwork. Instead, they found small discussion groups led by professional facilitators, each mixing staff from different departments, ranks, and backgrounds. Andre moved between sessions, observing the conversations. In one room, a white ground crew supervisor tearfully admitted how he'd overlooked qualified minority candidates because they didn't seem like the right fit. In another, flight attendants shared stories of harassment they'd never reported because that's just how things were. "It's like lancing a boil," Michael commented as they compared notes over lunch. "Painful but necessary for healing." By day 2, the groups had shifted from acknowledgement to action planning. Teams collaborated on specific changes for their departments, revamping hiring protocols, creating anonymous reporting systems, establishing mentorship programs. The most powerful moment came when CEO Richard Harrington addressed all employees, abandoning his prepared remarks for something more personal. "I've been with Skyline for 22 years, he began. And I've been blind, willfully blind, to what was happening around me. I told myself we were a meritocracy. That success here was based solely on performance." He paused, visibly emotional. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." On the final day, Andre found himself seated next to Tyler and a handful of other pilots from different backgrounds, drafting new standards for the Flight Operations Division. "What about the black box meetings?" Tyler suggested. "The what?" another pilot asked. "Anonymous feedback sessions after training and evaluations," Tyler explained. "No names attached to comments, so junior pilots can flag unfair treatment without fear of reprisal." Andre nodded. "That could work. Let's include it." By the time operations resumed, Skyline had developed over 50 concrete policy changes and created permanent structures for ongoing improvement. The Diversity and Inclusion Council had been formalized with budget, authority, and board-level reporting. As Andre prepared for his first flight after the shutdown, he found a different atmosphere on the flight deck. The awkward silences and tense exchanges had been replaced by something more genuine. Not perfect harmony, that would take time, but authentic engagement. Captain Wilson, his new first officer, said as they completed pre-flight checks, "I just wanted to say, what you did took real courage." Andre nodded, appreciating the comment but keenly aware that the work was far from finished. The policies were changing, but culture would take longer. And beyond Skyline, other airlines were watching, some already conducting their own internal reviews as pilots nationwide began comparing experiences. The real test would come in the months and years ahead, in promotion decisions, hiring practices, and daily interactions. But something fundamental had shifted, there was no going back to the old ways. 6 months later, Andre stood at the podium of the National Aviation Conference, looking out at a sea of faces from airlines across the country. The invitations had started coming shortly after Skyline's story made national headlines, first for small panel discussions, then for keynote addresses like this one. "The day I was left standing outside that door wasn't the first time I'd faced discrimination," Andre began. "But I decided it would be the last time I stayed silent about it." In the front row sat his Skyline colleagues, Michael, Diane, Tyler, and many others who had joined the movement. Behind them were pilots, flight attendants, and executives from dozens of airlines, some who had implemented their own versions of Skyline's reforms, others still resistant but feeling the pressure to change. "What happened at Skyline wasn't just about race," Andre continued. "It was about power, culture, and the courage to challenge systems that protect some while holding others back. When we decided to speak up collectively, we discovered our true strength." The changes at Skyline had exceeded even Andre's expectations. The quarterly diversity report, now publicly available on the company website, showed measurable improvements in hiring, promotion, and retention of minority employees. Complaint resolution times had dropped from months to days. Employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Keith Hudson had eventually resigned, along with 3 other executives implicated in the worst discrimination cases. More importantly, the new leadership team reflected the diversity of Skyline's workforce for the first time in company history. As Andre concluded his speech, he shared the news that still felt surreal. Next month, I'll be stepping into a new role as Skyline's Chief Operating Officer. 20 years ago, when I joined as a young pilot, I couldn't have imagined this possibility. Not because I doubted my abilities, but because the path was deliberately obstructed. The applause was thunderous. Afterward, a young black woman in a pilot's uniform approached him. "Captain Wilson," she said, "I just completed flight school. When I was deciding which airline to apply to, I chose Skyline because of what you did. You showed us all that change is possible." Driving home that evening, Andre thought about how one moment, being left outside that door, had catalyzed such profound change. He thought about all the people who had stood outside metaphorical doors throughout their careers, denied opportunities they had earned. The work wasn't finished. It might never be. But doors that had once been closed were now open, and newer pilots like that young woman would walk through them because someone had refused to accept being left outside. Sometimes, Andre reflected, shutting down an airline was exactly what it needed to truly take flight.